One of the earlier cases that addressed the matter of federal rights versus state power was McCulloch versus Maryland. Two issues were at stake here.
The underlying issue in the case had to do with the power of the United States to charter a national bank.
Well, we go to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which enumerates the powers which the Constitution gives Congress. No place in that list of enumerated powers does it say explicitly that Congress has the power to charter a bank. I mean, it can raise an army and navy, it can regulate commerce and this and that. It doesn't say it can charter a bank.
States, again, were trying to ensure that their citizens use state banknotes and use their own monetary system. And the national government creates the first bank of the United States. The goal there, one of the goals, was to eliminate all these various forms of currency.
And then a second issue in the case had to do with the power of the states to tax or regulate the operations of national banks within their state boundaries, if indeed there was to be a national bank.
In the end, the Supreme Court upheld the authority of Congress to establish a national bank. In so doing, it handed down one of the most important decisions in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court.
I would argue that McCulloch is the greatest case ever decided because Marshall takes the Constitution and talks about what are expressed powers, what are implied powers, and what those powers can be used for. And through his interpretation of what those powers are, he makes it clear that the national government's power can prevail over the state.
Today, the Congress establishes all sorts of corporations and involved with many things that are barely mentioned in the Constitution. But in those days, Congress had not previously established a corporation, and there's no enumerated power to establish a corporation.
Well, here's how the court resolved the case. Chief Justice Marshall decided that despite the fact that there's no specifically enumerated power of the national government to charter a bank, that such a power is nevertheless implied in the clause of the Constitution, which gives the national government those powers that are necessary and proper to the execution of the specifically or explicitly enumerated and delegated powers.
In his opinion, Chief Justice Marshall wrote,
"The power to tax involves the power to destroy. If the states may tax one instrument of the federal government, they may tax any and every other instrument. The mail, the mint, patent rights, judicial process. This was not intended by the American people. They did not design to make their government dependent on the states."
The great test of McCulloch is actually carved into the granite of the building, or the marble of the building. And what the opinion is the most beautifully written opinion you'll ever read.
So McCulloch against Maryland really strikes a major blow for federal against state power early on in our national history. It represents a decisive moment at which national power is expanded at the expense of the states. Now, that doesn't mean that state power is completely overridden, but certainly national power is expanded, and where national power expands, state power necessarily retracts.
I do often tell my students that if I was sent to a desert island and I could take one thing to read, I would take McCulloch versus Maryland, because it's all things for all times. The case talks about what power means, the relationship of power from the national government to the state, who has it, when they don't, what those limitations of powers are. And really the Constitution itself is all about power, the grants and limits of it. And McCulloch, to me, teaches that all by itself.